In this video, we uncover the darkest side of Australian history: female murderers whose shocking crimes stunned an entire nation. From brutal betrayals to chilling motives, you won't believe these women shattered every stereotype and left behind stories too horrifying to forget. Stay tuned as we reveal who they were, what drove them to kill, and why their names still haunt Australia today. You won't see these cases the same way again. 1. Jessica Ellen Stasinowsky. Jessica Ellen Stasinowsky was 21 years old at the time of Stacey Mitchell's murder in December 2006, living in Perth, Western Australia. Her childhood was marked by instability, family separation, and emotional struggles. Friends and acquaintances later described her as withdrawn and troubled, often engaging in self-destructive behavior, such as self-harm. Outwardly, Jessica appeared quiet and unremarkable, giving little hint of the violence she would one day commit. The events leading to the crime began when 16-year-old Stacey Mitchell, a recent arrival from England, ran away from home and stayed with Jessica and her partner, 19-year-old Valerie Parashumti. Almost immediately, tensions formed. Jessica believed Stacey was flirting with Valerie, fueling jealousy and insecurity within their volatile relationship. The pair's connection was intense and codependent, marked by emotional manipulation and obsession. That toxic dynamic would soon spiral into lethal violence. In the days leading up to the murder, there were warning signs. Jessica reportedly attempted to harm Stacey in small, insidious ways, such as putting broken glass in her drink or creating hazards around the house. These attempts hinted at a growing intent that neither Stacey nor those around them fully realized. On December 18, 2006, after a night of drinking whiskey and taking sleeping pills, events turned deadly. Valerie struck Stacey with a concrete block, and Jessica placed a chain around her neck, holding it there until Stacey lost consciousness. Rather than expressing shock or remorse, the pair displayed a chilling indifference. They kissed over Stacey's body and recorded video footage of the aftermath, mocking her accent and behavior in what investigators later described as an alarming lack of empathy. Stacey's body was placed in a wheelie bin and left in the backyard of the house. When police discovered the crime, Jessica and Valerie initially denied involvement. However, evidence at the scene combined with their own confessions confirmed their roles. Their actions following the murder, such as visiting a hardware store in search of tools to dispose of the body, further demonstrated the calculated nature of the crime. During their trial at the Supreme Court of Western Australia, Jessica and Valerie shocked the public with their demeanor. They were seen whispering, giggling, and smirking in court behavior that prosecutors described as disturbingly detached from the gravity of the charges. The presiding judge called their actions evil and sexually perverse, highlighting the unusual emotional undertones in the case. Both women were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 24 years before eligibility for parole. Psychological assessments suggested Valerie suffered from a severe personality disorder and fascination with vampirism, while Jessica's behavior reflected deep emotional dependency and jealousy. Their case remains one of Australia's most infamous examples of toxic obsession leading to murder. Jessica Stasinowsky's story forces an unsettling question. How can love, jealousy, and emotional chaos transform into such cold-blooded violence? Kristi Abrahams. Kristi Abrahams was 30 years old when she was arrested for the murder of her 6-year-old daughter, Keisha Wypert. Born in 1983, Abrahams grew up in a deeply fractured family, raised amid violence, instability, and neglect. She discovered her mother's body when she was just 10 years old and spent much of her youth in foster care. Friends and social workers later described a girl who never received the love or guidance she desperately needed, scars that carried into adulthood and shaped the way she parented her own child. Abraham's personal life was turbulent. She struggled with intellectual challenges and emotional volatility, and her relationships were often chaotic. Those close to her noticed how she became frustrated with Keisha's behavior, particularly the child's resemblance to her biological father. Over time, her anger and resentment toward her daughter escalated. with social workers documenting multiple injuries and neglect concerns. Keisha was briefly placed in foster care after sustaining a bite wound at 15 months. Yet despite these warning signs, she was eventually returned to her mother. By 2010, Kristi Abrahams was living with her partner, Robert Smith, in Mount Druitt, a suburb of Sydney. On July 18th of that year, Keisha died inside their home. The exact cause of death remains unknown. No single injury could be determined as fatal. What investigators do know is that the child had suffered repeated physical abuse over months' injuries to her head, jaw, and body that were consistent with blunt force trauma. In the days that followed, Abrahams and Smith concealed Keisha's body. They placed her remains in a suitcase, transported it to nearby bushland, and set it alight before burying her in a shallow grave. Weeks later, they reported Keisha missing, claiming she had vanished from her bed during the night. For 8 months, the case gripped Australia. The public searched, prayed, and hoped for a different outcome. The truth emerged in 2011. When Abrahams confessed to an undercover officer, her admission led police to the burial site, where Keisha's remains were finally recovered. The revelation devastated the community and shattered the illusion of a missing child mystery. It was now a homicide investigation. In 2013, Kristi Abrahams pleaded guilty to murder and interfering with a corpse. She received a total sentence of 21.5 years, with a non-parole period of 16. The courtroom was filled with raw anger. Family members and former friends shouted "rot in hell" as she was led away. The judge acknowledged Abraham's traumatic past, but emphasized that Keisha, a vulnerable and defenseless child, deserved safety and love and received neither. Kristi Abrahams' story forces a haunting question. When cycles of abuse repeat across generations, how do we break them? And how many children must suffer, Singh, before we do? 3. Gunn-Britt Ashfield. Gunn-Britt Ashfield, later known as Angelic Karstrom, was just 25 when she committed one of Australia's most shocking crimes, the murder of her own son, 6-year-old John Ashfield. Born in 1968, she grew up in a fractured home life, marked by instability and poverty. Friends and neighbors described her as troubled and withdrawn, often struggling to cope with the pressures of raising 5 young children in Knorr, New South Wales. Outwardly, she appeared like any other young mother, but behind closed doors, tensions within the home were escalating to dangerous extremes. Ashfield's personal struggles were compounded by her volatile relationship with her partner, Austin Allen Hughes. Both were described as emotionally unstable and prone to anger. In early August 1993, an incident sparked a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. Ashfield believed John had acted inappropriately toward his younger sister, though this claim was never substantiated. In a misguided attempt to discipline him, she and Hughes decided to teach him a lesson, a decision that spiraled into prolonged abuse. Over the course of several hours on August 5, 1993, John endured a brutal beating inside the family home. The objects used were not knives or guns, but everyday household items, a hammer and a telephone book, wielded in a pattern of punishment that left over 100 marks on his small body. His siblings, all under the age of 8, were forced to witness the ordeal, an experience that would leave lasting psychological scars. The following day, John succumbed to his injuries at Shoalhaven Hospital. In the immediate aftermath, Ashfield and Hughes attempted to conceal the truth. They told authorities that John had been attacked by strangers in a nearby park. But inconsistencies in their story, combined with medical evidence of repeated abuse, quickly unraveled the lie. Within 24 hours, both were arrested and charged with murder. The trial revealed a harrowing history of neglect and prior warnings to child protection services. Despite more than 30 notifications about potential harm in the household, little action had been taken before John's death. Public outrage was swift and intense. The community of Knorr was rocked by protests outside the courthouse, demanding justice for the boy whose short life had been marred by suffering. Ashfield pleaded guilty to murder, and was sentenced to 21 years in prison, later reduced to 19 on appeal with a minimum of 14 years. Hughes received a similar sentence. After serving 18 years, Ashfield was released on parole in 2011 under strict conditions forbidden even to visit her son's grave. The case leaves behind an unsettling question. How does a system fail so completely, allowing warning signs to be ignored until a child's cries are silenced forever? 4. Valmae Faye Beck. Valmae Faye Beck, later known as Faye Cram, was 43 years old when she took part in one of Queensland's most notorious child murders. Born in 1944, Beck grew up in Western Australia in a turbulent household and carried unresolved trauma into adulthood. By the mid-1980s, she was a mother of 6, from a previous relationship, struggling with low self-worth and a desperate need for love. That vulnerability led her into the orbit of Barry Watts, a man whose violent fantasies would come to define both of their lives. Their relationship was unequal from the beginning. Watts was controlling, and Beck was terrified of losing him. Over time, she became complicit in his escalating fantasies, which centered around abducting and assaulting young girls. Friends later recalled that Beck's personality seemed to diminish around him, a quiet acquiescence that turned deadly when she agreed to help lure a child into harm's way. On November 27, 1987, their plan came to life in Noosa, Queensland. 12-year-old Sian Kingi was riding her bicycle home from shopping with her mother when Beck approached her in a park pretending to search for a lost dog. While Sian stopped to help, Watts attacked from behind, forcing her into their car. She was bound, driven to remote bushland, and later killed. The crime shocked the nation not only because of its brutality, but because it was committed by a married couple, one acting as bait, the other as executioner. For 6 days, the Kingi family and the local community searched in vain. When Sian's body was discovered in a creek bed, police launched a massive investigation. Witnesses recalled a suspicious white Holden station wagon and a couple matching Watts and Beck's descriptions. It was through this vehicle and persistent police work that the pair was tracked across state lines and arrested in December 1987. During questioning, Beck eventually broke down and confessed. Her testimony not only detailed Watts's actions, but revealed her own involvement in restraining and deceiving the child. In 1988, both were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case became one of Australia's most infamous examples of a killer couple, igniting public outrage and calls for tougher sentences. Psychologists later speculated that Beck's compliance stemmed from deep emotional dependency and fear of abandonment. Yet her willingness to participate and later watch as her husband carried out his violent acts revealed a disturbing capacity for detachment. Beck divorced Watts in 1990, expressed regret, and changed her name to Faye Cram, but she never escaped public scorn. She died in 2008 while still incarcerated, taking to her grave possible knowledge of other unsolved crimes. The memory of Sian Kingi's life and the innocence stolen from her still lingers. It poses an unanswerable question: what transforms an ordinary mother into an accomplice to unimaginable cruelty? 5. Stormbrook. Stormbrook was just 23 years old when she committed what remains one of the most infamous crimes inside an Australian women's prison. Born in 1967, Brooke's early years were shaped by hardship and instability. She drifted into a life of petty crime as a teenager, escalating to armed robberies in her 20s. By the time she arrived at Brisbane's notorious Bogo Road jail, she was already serving a sentence for violent offenses. But no one could have predicted what would unfold behind those prison walls. Life inside Bogo Road in the late 1980s was harsh and overcrowded. The women's wing was tense, with simmering rivalries and scarce resources fueling constant conflict. Brooke, described by fellow inmates as volatile and quick-tempered, often clashed with others. Her reputation for toughness was as much a survival tactic as it was a reflection of her inner turmoil. Those who knew her spoke of someone hardened by years of chaos, yet craving respect, in an environment where vulnerability was dangerous. On January 7, 1990, tensions inside the prison boiled over. A heated altercation erupted between Brooke and another inmate, Debbie Dick. Accounts differ on what sparked the confrontation. Some say it began as an argument, others suggest it was part of a larger feud brewing in the unit. What is clear is how quickly the situation escalated. In the chaos, Brooke grabbed a sharpened barbecue fork, a crude makeshift weapon, and attacked. In a matter of moments, the fight turned deadly. Despite attempts by other prisoners to intervene, including one who fought her off with a chair, Debbie Dick succumbed to her injuries. It was the first and only murder to occur inside an Australian women's prison. The investigation was swift. Brooke was immediately taken into custody, placed in isolation for more than a year, and later charged with murder. In 1990, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The ruling underscored the gravity of committing such an act in a secure facility, sending shockwaves through both the prison population and the public. While serving her sentence, Brooke made headlines again in 1993 when she escaped from custody scaling a 5-meter wall with knotted sheets and remaining at large for 2 months before being recaptured. It added to her notoriety, painting her as both dangerous and resourceful. Psychologists who later assessed Brooke pointed to her history of trauma exposure to violence and difficulties regulating anger. Her actions were seen not as premeditated murder, but as the culmination of an explosive temperament in extreme conditions. Yet this context offered little solace to the family of Debbie Dick, whose death remains a painful reminder of the violence that can erupt behind bars. Storm Brooke was paroled in 2011 after serving 21 years. Her story prompts an unsettling question. When violence follows someone, even into the confines of prison, is it the individual or the system that has truly failed? 6. Lindy Chamberlain-Creighton. Lindy Chamberlain-Creighton was 34 years old when she became the central figure in one of Australia's most polarizing murder trials. Born Alice Lynn Murchison in New Zealand, she moved to Australia as a child and grew up in a devout Seventh-day Adventist family. In 1969, she married Michael Chamberlain, a pastor, and together they built what appeared to be a quiet, faith-centered life with their growing family. By 1980, they had 3 children and were about to welcome their first daughter, Azaria. That August, the Chamberlains traveled to Uluru for a family camping trip. On the night of August 17th, Lindy put 9-week-old Azaria to bed in a tent, while the rest of the family gathered by a campfire nearby. Moments later, she cried out words that would become infamous: "A dingo's got my baby." Despite an intensive search, Azaria's body was never found. All that was discovered was her blood-stained jumpsuit located near a dingo lair. Initially, authorities believed Lindy's account, but as time passed, suspicion grew. Forensic analysis of the Chamberlain's car suggested the presence of blood, and prosecutors began to theorize a chilling alternative: that Lindy had fabricated the story and killed her own child. In 1982, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Her husband, Michael, was convicted as an accessory after the fact. Lindy maintained her innocence throughout, even as she gave birth to her 4th child while incarcerated. The public was sharply divided. Some believed her. Others vilified her in the press, questioning her composure and religious beliefs. The case gripped Australia, sparking fierce debate over justice media bias and the influence of circumstantial evidence in high-profile trials. Everything changed in 1986. A missing piece of Azaria's clothing, a matinee jacket prosecutors had long claimed did not exist, was discovered near a dingo den close to Uluru. The find supported Lindy's original account and undermined the prosecution's theory. Her life sentence was quickly remitted, and 2 years later, her conviction was overturned entirely. A royal commission found that reasonable doubt surrounded every aspect of the original verdict, exposing serious flaws in the forensic evidence presented at trial. In the years that followed, Lindy rebuilt her life, remarried, and published an autobiography sharing her experience. In 2012, more than 3 decades after Azaria's death, a final inquest formally ruled that a dingo was responsible, clearing her name beyond question. The dingo trial remains one of Australia's most infamous miscarriages of justice, a case that challenged public perception and revealed how grief media frenzy and flawed science can collide to destroy lives. It leaves us asking, when truth is drowned out by speculation, how many voices are silenced before justice finally speaks? 7. Eugenia Falleni. Eugenia Falleni, born in 1875 in Italy, lived a life defined by disguise. Moving with her family to New Zealand as a child, she grew up under strict and often hostile parents. From a young age, Falleni rejected the role expected of her. She dressed as a boy, ran away repeatedly, and sought work in brickyards and stables where only men were hired. By her teens, she was living full-time as a man, calling herself Harry Crawford, an identity she would maintain for decades. Life at sea offered escape, but it also brought trauma. While working aboard a merchant ship, her biological sex was discovered. Accounts suggest she was ostracized by the crew and assaulted by the captain, eventually put ashore in Australia, pregnant and alone. The child she bore, Josephine, was placed in another woman's care. From then on, Falleni lived entirely as Harry Crawford, a quiet, physically strong man who found work driving carriages, laboring in factories, and later running small businesses. In 1913, Harry met Annie Burkett, a widowed mother. They married, and for 4 years lived a turbulent life in Sydney. Whether Annie knew Harry's secret remains unclear, but neighbors described frequent arguments and growing tensions, especially after Falleni's daughter re-entered the picture. In 1917, Annie vanished following a picnic near Lane Cove River. Days later, a woman's charred body was found in nearby scrubland, unrecognizable, unidentified, and buried as unknown. For 3 years, suspicion lingered, but evidence was scarce. Falleni remarried during that time, still living as Harry Crawford. But Annie's teenage son eventually came forward with troubling memories and suspicions about his stepfather. Investigators reopened the case, linking the unidentified remains to Annie Burkett. In 1920, Harry Crawford was arrested, and the shocking revelation followed. Harry was, in fact, Eugenia Falleni. The ensuing trial gripped Sydney. Sensational headlines dubbed it the man-woman case. Court testimony fixated less on the circumstantial evidence of murder and more on Falleni's gender identity, which society at the time viewed as deceitful and immoral. The prosecution portrayed her life as a calculated fraud. The defense described her as a misunderstood invert. Using the language of the era, Falleni was convicted of Annie's murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. After serving 11 years, she was released in 1931 on the condition that she resume living as a woman, adopting the name Jean Ford. She ran a small boarding house in Sydney until 1938, when she died in a traffic accident. To this day, questions remain. Was Annie's death truly murder, or a tragic accident magnified by prejudice against Falleni's identity? The case forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality when personal truth collides with public fear. Can justice ever be impartial? 8. Yvonne Gladys Fletcher. Yvonne Gladys Fletcher was 30 years old when police finally uncovered the truth that 2 of her husbands had died the same mysterious way. A quiet housewife and mother from Newtown, Sydney, Fletcher seemed unremarkable to those who knew her. Born in 1922, she grew up in modest circumstances, living a life that on the surface reflected the expectations of a working-class woman of the era marriage children and the hope of stability. But behind closed doors, her family life was turbulent, marked by strained relationships and financial hardship. Her first husband, Desmond Butler, died in 1948 after months of unexplained illness. At the time, his symptoms puzzled doctors, progressive weakness confusion, and excruciating pain. There was no investigation. Fletcher mourned quietly and carried on raising their 2 young children. 4 years later, she married again. Her second husband, Bertrand Bluey Fletcher, was a rat bait layer, a man whose work ironically gave Yvonne easy access to thallium, a potent poison, then sold freely as pest control. By early 1952, Bluey began suffering eerily similar symptoms to Desmond's final illness. Friends noticed, whispered their suspicions, and alerted authorities. Thallium poisoning was not unheard of in Australia at the time. Inner Sydney's rat infestations had led to widespread use of the chemical, and tragically, it was sometimes misused in human crimes. Detectives investigating Bluey's death exhumed the remains of Desmond Butler, revealing identical traces of thallium. This discovery shattered the coincidence and cemented suspicion. Arrested in May 1952, Fletcher faced trial for the murder of Desmond Butler, the first prosecution of its kind in Australia for murder by thallium. During the hearings, the court painted two contrasting portraits of her. The prosecution described calculated coldness, a woman who had twice secretly poisoned her husbands, letting them die slow, agonizing deaths. The defense suggested desperation, especially in her second marriage, where accounts of abuse and domestic strife emerged. Public fascination soared. The notion of a young mother quietly administering poison to two unsuspecting men shocked Sydney. Newspapers reported every detail from her stoic expression in court to the moment she collapsed when hearing her death sentence. Though condemned to hang, Fletcher's fate changed when New South Wales abolished the death penalty shortly after her conviction. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. After serving just over a decade, she was released in 1964, fading into obscurity. As for motive, psychologists and historians have debated whether Fletcher acted out of malice, escape from abuse, or a desperate search for control in an era with few options for women trapped in unhappy marriages. Her case lingers as a haunting question. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a woman driven to an unthinkable act by desperation? And how thin is the line between victim and villain when viewed through the lens of history? 9. Kathleen Folbigg. Kathleen Megan Folbigg was 36 years old when she stood accused of what would become one of Australia's most shocking crimes, the deaths of her 4 infant children. Outwardly, she appeared to be an ordinary mother living in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales with her husband Craig. But behind that facade was a childhood scarred by tragedy. At just 18 months old, Kathleen's father murdered her mother. She spent the rest of her childhood in foster care, shuffled between homes, never truly feeling she belonged. That early trauma shaped a woman who longed for family, yet struggled to cope with the demands of motherhood. Friends later described her as distant, prone to mood swings, and obsessively focused on her weight and personal freedom. In her own diaries, she confided feelings of resentment toward her children, describing moments of frustration and exhaustion that seemed to build with each birth. Between 1989 and 1999, 4 babies were born into the Folbigg household: Caleb, Patrick, Sarah, and Laura. Each died suddenly before reaching the age of 2. Caleb was the first at just 19 days old. His death was attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. Patrick followed the next year, surviving an initial collapse that left him with epilepsy, only to die months later. Sarah and Laura's deaths came years apart, both officially unexplained at the time. To doctors and investigators, the pattern was tragic, but not necessarily criminal until Kathleen's own words came to light. The turning point came in 1999. After Laura's death, Craig Folbigg discovered Kathleen's personal diaries hidden in their home. The entries revealed a woman plagued by guilt, admitting to flashes of anger and confessing thoughts that prosecutors would later argue were veiled admissions of murder. With Sarah, she wrote, "All I wanted was for her to shut up." And one day, she did. In 2001, police charged Folbigg with the deaths of all 4 children. The trial relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, medical testimony, the improbability of 4 natural infant deaths in one family, and the haunting diary passages. The defense maintained the children had died of natural causes, citing conditions like SIDS and undiagnosed illnesses. After a 7-week trial, the jury convicted Folbigg of 3 counts of murder, 1 of manslaughter, and 1 of grievous bodily harm. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, later reduced to 30 on appeal. The case sparked intense debate not only about the evidence, but also about how society views mothers who kill. Was she a cold-blooded murderer, or a deeply damaged woman overwhelmed by her own past? Years later, scientific studies on genetic mutations in 2 of the children would reignite questions of her guilt. But regardless of the legal outcome, the story of Kathleen Folbigg forces us to confront an unsettling question when maternal instinct fails. How do we comprehend the unimaginable? 10. Caroline Grills. Caroline Mickelson Grills was 63 years old when whispers began to spread about the quiet grandmother from New South Wales. Known affectionately as Aunt Carrie to her extended family, she appeared harmless, a short woman with thick glasses and a reputation for hospitality. Friends and relatives welcomed her visits, often accompanied by home-baked cakes and steaming cups of tea. But beneath this matronly exterior was one of Australia's most notorious poisoners, later known to the press as Aunt Thally. Caroline's life had been shaped by hardship. Born around 1890 to a working-class family in Balmain, she married young and raised 6 children, enduring the loss of 2 sons in tragic circumstances. Over the years, she drifted between homes, with her husband finally settling in Gladesville after inheriting her father's house. By all outward appearances, she was the kind of family matriarch. People trusted the one who came to visit the sick, the lonely, and the elderly. But starting in 1947, tragedy seemed to follow her wherever she went. Elderly relatives and in-laws began falling ill with strange symptoms, hair loss, blindness, tremors, and eventually death. These ailments baffled doctors at the time, yet they followed a chilling pattern. Each victim had recently been in Caroline's company, and many had shared food or tea prepared by her. The poison was thallium, a common rat bait in mid-century Sydney, nearly undetectable and terrifyingly effective. Among those who died were Caroline's stepmother, Christine Mickelson, relatives by marriage, Angelina Thomas and John Lundberg, and her sister-in-law, Mary Ann Mickelson. Suspicion grew quietly within the family, but it wasn't until 1953 that events came to a head. That year, Eveline Lundberg and her daughter, Christine Downey, fell violently ill after one of Caroline's visits. Eveline's son, already partially blinded by an earlier unexplained sickness, noticed something unsettling. Caroline appeared to slip her hand into her dress pocket before serving tea. He switched cups, saving the contents, and took it to police. Tests revealed thallium, the final piece investigators needed. Exhumations of earlier victims confirmed traces of poison, and Caroline Grills was arrested on May 11, 1953. The trial drew national attention. Prosecutors portrayed her as a woman who killed without clear motive, sometimes gaining financially, other times seemingly for the thrill. In court, her demeanor was unsettling, marked by outbursts of laughter and defiant statements. "I helped to live, not to kill," she insisted, even as evidence mounted against her. Convicted of attempted murder, she was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Behind bars, fellow inmates dubbed her Aunt Thally, a grim nod to her weapon of choice. She remained an enigma to the end, dying in 1960 of natural causes. Her story leaves us with a haunting question. How do we reconcile the image of a kindly grandmother with the reality of deliberate patient killing, served 1 cup of tea at a time? 11. Brenda Hodge. Brenda Hodge was 33 years old when she became the last person in Australia to be sentenced to death. To the public, her crime seemed shocking, the murder of her de facto partner, a police officer named Peter Rafferty. But to understand that moment, you have to trace the long and fractured road that brought her there. Born Dorothy Brenda White in 1951, her childhood was marked by relentless hardship. Raised by an alcoholic mother in Victoria, Brenda endured physical abuse, neglect, and sexual violence from an early age, first by a babysitter, later by her own father. Shuffled between foster care reformatories and mental institutions, she never found the safety or stability most children take for granted. By adolescence, she had learned to survive by running leaving homes, relationships, and jobs whenever chaos threatened to consume her. As an adult, Brenda drifted across Australia working farm jobs, marrying briefly, and struggling with depression and alcohol abuse. By the early 1980s, she had settled in Western Australia and entered a relationship with Peter Rafferty, a police sergeant. Friends described the couple as volatile. Their arguments were fueled by Rafferty's drinking and Brenda's unprocessed trauma, but also by the sheer inability of two damaged people to communicate. By March 1983, she had decided to leave him. The day of the murder began with Brenda packing her belongings. An argument erupted she would later describe only fragments of memory, the sound of shouting, the whirring in her ears, and the moment she lifted a shotgun and pulled the trigger. Rafferty retreated to a shed. She followed, firing again. Moments later, she left the house dazed, buying a soda at a nearby deli before confessing to a friend, and then finally to police. At trial, prosecutors painted the killing as cold-blooded. The defense described a woman overwhelmed by depression and years of unresolved abuse. In August 1984, Brenda Hodge was sentenced to hang, the last death sentence issued in Australia. The penalty was later commuted to life imprisonment, and Western Australia soon abolished the death penalty entirely. Prison became both punishment and turning point. For the first time, Brenda stopped running. She pursued education, earning a degree in English, discovering poetry, and eventually writing an autobiography. She converted to Catholicism and by most accounts became a model inmate. After serving 12 years, she was paroled in 1995. Even in freedom, her story divided public opinion. Supporters saw redemption. Critics saw evasion of responsibility, especially Rafferty's children, who lost their father and felt her remorse came too late. Brenda herself admitted she would never fully reconcile what she had done. Her life raises an unsettling question. Can a person's worst act define them forever? Or can even those who take a life find a path to something resembling peace? 12. Amanda Jane Kelly. Amanda Jane Kelly was only 20 years old when she found herself at the center of one of Western Australia's most shocking drug-fueled murders. Born in December 1992, Kelly grew up in Perth amid personal challenges and emotional instability. By her late teens, she had gravitated toward a lifestyle marked by substance use and troubled relationships, including one with Jonathan Lee, who would later become her co-offender. Kelly's early years remain less documented than her crime, but court records reveal a pattern of psychological struggles and dependence on drugs. Friends described her as vulnerable, easily influenced, and desperate for belonging traits that may have made her susceptible to the chaotic world she entered as a young adult. In May 2012, Kelly, Jonathan Lee, and their acquaintance Sam Walker spent days using methamphetamine and cannabis in a South Fremantle home. Their lives were spiraling, sleepless, paranoid, and detached from reality. It was during this binge that Walker invited another young man, 24-year-old David Houston, to the house. Houston, a casual acquaintance, likely expected nothing more than another night of drug use. What followed instead was senseless violence. Accounts differ slightly, but the sequence is chilling in its irrationality. Walker announced he intended to kill Houston. Rather than stopping him, Kelly retreated to the bathroom with Lee. When she emerged, Walker had already begun strangling Houston. Lee joined in the assault. Kelly did not intervene. As the attack ended, Houston's body was wrapped in a barbecue cover and loaded into a vehicle. The group drove south toward Bunbury, burying him in a shallow bush grave and attempting to conceal the crime with acid lime and concrete. For weeks, Houston's family searched for answers. The truth unraveled when police traced a rented utility vehicle through GPS data, leading investigators directly to the burial site. Kelly and the two men were arrested and charged with murder. During trial, prosecutors described the crime as gratuitous and irrational, emphasizing its ferocity and lack of provocation. Keli pleaded guilty but argued she played a lesser role than her co-offenders. The court acknowledged her remorse and psychological difficulties, but concluded she made no effort to stop the killing or seek help afterward. In December 2013, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a 14-year minimum term, meaning she will be eligible for parole in 2026. Psychologists later suggested Keli's actions stemmed from a mixture of drug-induced disconnection and a long-standing pattern of emotional neglect. Yet for Houston's family, those explanations offered little comfort. A promising young man's life had been ended without reason, and the wounds left behind have never fully healed. Keli's case forces us to confront a haunting reality when chaos and addiction collide with fractured lives. How thin is the line between passive witness and active participant, and what does justice look like for both? 13. Katherine Mary Knight. Katherine Mary Knight was 44 years old when she committed one of Australia's most infamous murders and became the first woman in the nation sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Born in 1955 in the rural town of Aberdeen, New South Wales, Knight's early life was shaped by chaos and abuse. Her parents' scandalous affair fractured two families, and her father's violent alcoholism left deep scars. Katherine later claimed she endured years of sexual abuse in childhood, a pattern psychiatrists believe contributed to the volatile personality that emerged as she grew older. At school, she was remembered as two extremes, quiet and polite, when calm yet frighteningly aggressive when angered. By 15, she left school illiterate, taking work in an abattoir where she quickly rose to a skilled boner, a trade that gave her both employment and an unsettling comfort with knives. Even in her bedroom, she hung them above her bed, always handy, as she would later say. Her adult relationships followed a disturbing pattern: intense passion, escalating violence, and sudden rages. Partners described beatings, threats, even attacks with frying pans and scissors. In one chilling episode, she placed her infant daughter on railway tracks during a breakdown only to retrieve her moments before a train passed. Despite multiple psychiatric admissions, she was repeatedly released back into the community. By the late 1990s, Knight was living with John Price, a well-liked father of three, and mine worker. Friends warned him about her violent past, but Price stayed even as their arguments grew more dangerous. In early 2000, after yet another violent clash, Price obtained a restraining order, a decision that enraged Katherine and set the stage for tragedy. On February 29, 2000, Knight arrived at Price's home late at night. She cooked a meal, took a shower, and woke him for intimacy, a calm before the storm. Hours later, she attacked as he slept, stabbing him repeatedly. Price fled through the house in terror, but collapsed before he could escape. By morning, police discovered a crime scene so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. Knight herself lay unconscious from an overdose, showing no immediate remorse. In 2001, Katherine Knight pleaded guilty to murder. The court heard about her long history of violent outbursts and her meticulous preparation. Psychiatrists diagnosed borderline personality disorder, but confirmed she knew right from wrong. The judge, calling the crime appalling and beyond contemplation, sentenced her to life without parole, the first time this had ever been imposed on an Australian woman. Katherine Knight remains incarcerated to this day. Her story leaves us with an unsettling question. How does someone who appears ordinary, even maternal, transform into the author of such unimaginable acts? 14. Frances Knorr. Frances Lydia Alice Knorr was only 25 years old when she was led to the gallows at Melbourne Jail in 1894. To the public, she was branded the baby farming murderess, a title that reflected both the horror of her crimes and the desperation of the era in which she lived. Born Minnie Thwaites in London, she emigrated to Australia at 19, seeking a new life, but soon found herself adrift. She married Rudolf Knorr, a German waiter, and tried to build a family, but financial hardship and instability followed her wherever she went. The early 1890s depression in Melbourne was unforgiving. Jobs were scarce, and there was no social welfare. Many women, particularly unmarried mothers, were forced into desperate measures to survive. Frances turned to baby farming, a grim practice in which struggling mothers paid others to care for their infants, often with tragic results. She moved frequently using different names, taking in children whose mothers could not keep them. Some she placed with other carers, but others simply vanished. By 1892, Frances's marriage was faltering, and Rudolph was sent to prison for fraud. Left alone, pregnant and penniless, she continued taking in infants. But as the months passed, children entrusted to her care began to die, deaths later shown to be deliberate. In 1893, a new tenant at Frances's former home in Brunswick unearthed a shallow grave while digging a garden bed. The body of a baby girl lay inside. Police searched further and discovered the remains of 2 more infants buried on properties where Frances had lived. Each had been strangled or suffocated. The press erupted, dubbing her crimes among the most shocking in Victoria's history. Frances was arrested in Sydney, heavily pregnant with her second child. Her calm words to Detective Keating, "I know what you have come for," hinted at resignation rather than denial. At trial, prosecutors revealed a letter she had written to a former lover, attempting to fabricate evidence and shift blame. She admitted burying the children, but insisted they had died naturally. The jury was unconvinced. After 5 days, she was found guilty of murder, the mandatory sentence death by hanging. Public reaction was divided. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer. Others viewed her as a desperate woman crushed by poverty and circumstance. Appeals for clemency failed. On January 15, 1894, Frances Knorr walked calmly to the gallows singing hymns. Her final words were steady, "The Lord is with me. I do not fear what men may do to me, for I have peace, perfect peace." Her death became a grim symbol of an era when infant mortality was high and society's safety nets were almost non-existent. Was Frances Knorr a remorseless murderer or a tragic figure consumed by the harshness of her time? The answer still echoes through Australia's criminal history. 15. Keli Lane. Keli Lane was just 21 years old when her newborn daughter, Tegan, vanished without a trace. A celebrated water polo player from Sydney's northern beaches, Lane appeared to embody the image of a rising star, athletic, outgoing, and ambitious. She came from a respected family, her father a former police officer, her life filled with sport and opportunity. But beneath that polished exterior, Lane was living a secret life, one marked by concealed pregnancies, desperate decisions, and ultimately a crime that would shock the nation. By 1996, Lane had already fallen pregnant several times, each time carefully hiding it from her parents, her teammates, and even her long-term partner. 2 of those babies had been placed for adoption. Others were terminated. Yet this time, after giving birth to Tegan Lee Lane at Auburn Hospital, Keli faced a decision she could no longer defer. Only 2 days after Tegan's birth, Lane attended a wedding with her boyfriend. Guests noticed nothing unusual, no sign that she had just given birth. Tegan was never seen again. For years, the baby's disappearance went unnoticed. It wasn't until 1999, during an unrelated adoption inquiry, that social workers uncovered inconsistencies in Lane's accounts of her pregnancies. Confronted, she claimed Tegan was alive, saying she had handed her over to the baby's father, a man named Andrew Morris, or perhaps Norris. Police scoured national records and schools, chasing every possible lead, but found no trace of Tegan or the man Lane described. The story simply didn't add up. The case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence. No body, no crime scene, no physical proof. Prosecutors argued Lane murdered Tegan to protect her reputation and ambitions as an athlete, that a child didn't fit into her vision of the future. The defense countered that there was no proof of death at all, suggesting Tegan could still be alive, her name, and circumstances changed. In 2010, after a 4-month trial and years of speculation, the jury returned its verdict guilty of murder. Lane collapsed in court as the decision was read. In 2011, she was sentenced to 18 years in prison with a non-parole period of 13 years and 5 months. She would be eligible for release in 2023. Psychological assessments found no evidence of mental illness. Lane's actions, experts said, stemmed not from delusion, but from problem-solving desperate attempts to hide pregnancies and avoid scandal. That insight made the case all the more haunting, not an act of madness, but of calculation. To this day, Tegan's body has never been found. The unanswered questions linger: what truly happened in those missing hours between hospital discharge and the wedding reception? And perhaps, most haunting of all, could there still be a truth that no one has yet uncovered? 16. John Lee. Jan Lee was 31 years old when she walked to the gallows in 1951, the last woman ever executed in Australia. Her story began far from the violence that would later define her. Born Marjorie Jean Maud Wright in rural New South Wales, she was raised in a working-class family and described as intelligent and spirited, though often rebellious. By 18, she had married and soon became a mother, but her marriage collapsed. And Jean, facing poverty and abandonment, left her daughter in her mother's care and drifted toward Melbourne in search of survival. In Melbourne, Jean's life unraveled into petty crime and sex work. It was there she met Robert Clayton, a career criminal whose charm was coupled with volatility. Their relationship was intense, violent, and inseparable. Together, they devised a scheme known in underworld slang as the Badger Game. Jean would lure men into compromising situations while Clayton played the outraged partner, extorting money in exchange for silence. It was a con that preyed on secrecy and shame, but it set the stage for a crime far darker. On the night of November 7th, 1949, Jean and Clayton, joined by fellow criminal Norman Andrews, encountered William Pop Kent, a 73-year-old bookmaker known to carry cash. They followed him to his flat in Carlton, intending robbery. Over the course of hours, Kent was restrained, beaten, and pressured to reveal where he hid his money. When the search turned up less than expected, the trio's plan spiraled. By morning, Kent was dead. The brutality of the crime shocked Melbourne. Police quickly tracked the group to a hotel room, still wearing clothing stained from the encounter. During interrogation, each suspect blamed the others. Jean claimed she was present but never intended harm. Prosecutors countered that under the law of common purpose. Her participation made her equally responsible. The trial in 1950 captivated the public. Jean's appearance striking, red-haired, and defiant drew both fascination and condemnation. While many supported the death sentence, advocacy groups argued that executing a woman was barbaric and pleaded for clemency. Their efforts failed. Jean's final months were marked by severe mood swings alternating between rage, despair, and hymns sung from her cell. On the morning of February 19th, 1951, she was sedated and half-conscious as guards carried her to the scaffold at Pentridge Prison. Minutes later, she became the last woman hanged in Australian history. Psychologists later viewed Jean not as a calculating mastermind, but as a woman trapped in cycles of abuse, poverty, and desperation. Still, the question lingers. Was justice served? Or did her execution simply mark the end of an era in which society punished not only the crime, but the woman herself? 17. Sarah Makin. Sarah Jane Makin was 47 years old when she and her husband, John, were placed on trial for a crime that would shock colonial Australia. The systematic killing of infants entrusted to their care. To the desperate mothers who sought them out, the Makins appeared as saviors offering shelter, food, and a chance for illegitimate children to be raised in a stable home. Behind closed doors, however, their household became a graveyard. Sarah's beginnings gave little hint of the infamy to come. Born in Sydney in 1845 to working-class parents, she endured a childhood marked by poverty but not scandal. She married young and, after the collapse of her first marriage, wed John Makin, a drayman from Dapto. Together, they raised 10 children of their own. But when John was injured in an accident, the family's finances crumbled. To survive, Sarah turned to a practice known at the time as baby farming, taking in illegitimate children for a fee, often with the promise of adoption. This arrangement seemed like salvation for unwed mothers ostracized by society. Yet the Makin's operation hid a chilling pattern. Infants taken into their home often disappeared, and the parents' weekly payments continued long after. Some babies were placed with new families. Others were never seen again. The case that exposed the Makins began in 1892, when 18-year-old Amber Murray sought someone to adopt her newborn son. Horace, she placed an advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald, offering payment to anyone willing to care for him. Sarah Makin responded, presenting herself as a grieving mother who longed for another child. Murray handed over Horace and a small sum of money, trusting she had secured him a better life. Within months, the Makins vanished, leaving Murray with no forwarding address and no child. The truth emerged by chance. In October 1892, workers clearing a drain at one of the Makins' former homes uncovered the remains of 2 infants buried in the yard. Police traced the family's frequent moves and exhumed more than a dozen tiny bodies from properties they had occupied. Among them was baby Horace, identified by his clothing. At trial, the Makins' own daughters testified against their parents, describing pawned baby clothes and sudden disappearances. The jury convicted both John and Sarah of murder under the principle of common purpose, meaning they were equally guilty, even if Sarah had not committed the final act herself. John was hanged in August 1893. Sarah's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and after 19 years, she was quietly paroled. The Makin case led to sweeping reforms in child welfare, but one haunting question endures. How many infants vanished, whose names we will never know? 18. Martha Needle. Martha Needle was only 30 years old when she stood before the gallows at Melbourne Jail in 1894. Known to history as the Black Widow of Richmond, she was convicted of poisoning her fiancé's brother, but that was only part of a much darker story. Behind her quiet smile and gentle demeanor, 5 people, including her own husband and 3 young children, had already died under suspiciously similar circumstances. Martha was born in 1863 near Morgan, South Australia. Her childhood was shaped by poverty and violence. Her family struggled, and accusations of abuse lingered in the background. At 17, she married Henry Needle, a carpenter, and over the next few years they welcomed 3 daughters, Mabel, Elsie, and May. Outwardly, the Needles appeared a modest working-class family moving to Richmond, Melbourne in search of better prospects. But life behind their doors was marked by frequent illness and sudden, inexplicable death. In 1885, Mabel, only 3 years old, died after a brief illness. 4 years later, Henry himself succumbed to mysterious symptoms followed soon by Elsie and May. Each death left Martha with an insurance payout, but instead of improving her circumstances, she spent the money on elaborate headstones and daily visits to the family grave. Neighbors pitied her loss. Few suspected anything sinister. By 1893, Martha had moved on, taking in lodgers and beginning a relationship with Otto Juncken, a local saddler. Their engagement was met with disapproval from Otto's brothers, particularly Louis Juncken. When Louis fell ill and died suddenly, the following year his death was blamed on typhoid fever, until Otto's other brother Herman arrived to settle the estate, and also fell violently ill after meals prepared by Martha. Suspicion mounted when Herman's doctor tested his vomit and found arsenic. Working with police, they staged a trap. Herman was served tea prepared by Martha while officers waited nearby. As soon as she tried to dispose of the cup, detectives intervened. Testing confirmed what many feared: the drink contained enough poison to kill several people. Investigators exhumed the bodies of Henry, Mabel, Elsie, May, and Louis. All showed traces of arsenic. Though insurance money had been collected, prosecutors never proved that financial gain was Martha's sole motive. Some believed she craved sympathy. Others saw signs of deep psychological instability shaped by a traumatic upbringing and possible undiagnosed mental illness. Martha Needle was found guilty after a 3-day trial. She maintained her innocence to the end, showing remarkable composure even as the death sentence was read. On the morning of October 22nd, 1894, when asked for final words, she simply replied, "I have nothing to say." Was Martha Needle a calculating killer, motivated by greed, or a broken woman shaped by hardship and tragedy? More than a century later, the answer remains as elusive as her calm final silence. 19. Martha Rendell. Martha Rendell was 38 years old when she became the last woman hanged in Western Australia. In October 1909, she faced the gallows at Fremantle Prison, convicted of murdering her de facto partner's son and suspected in the deaths of 2 more children. Her name would become synonymous with one of Australia's most infamous true crime stories, the Wicked Stepmother of Perth. Born in South Australia in 1871, Martha grew up in poverty and instability. She left home at 16, taking domestic work and bearing 3 illegitimate children before abandoning them to follow a lover west. By the early 1900s, she was living in Perth with Thomas Morris, a man separated from his wife, and caring for his 5 children. To neighbors, the household appeared unconventional but stable. Inside the home, tensions ran high. The children resented Martha, and local gossip portrayed her as strict and joyless, a woman far from the maternal ideal society expected. The first signs of trouble emerged in 1907. One by one, Thomas's children began falling gravely ill. 7-year-old Annie was the first to die, followed months later by 5-year-old Olive. In 1908, 14-year-old Arthur succumbed to the same mysterious throat affliction. Each death was certified as diphtheria by the attending physician. Only later would investigators allege that Martha had deliberately painted the children's throats with hydrochloric acid, mimicking the symptoms of disease and slowly starving them to death. For nearly 2 years, suspicions went unspoken until George, one of the surviving children, fled the home. He told authorities his stepmother had tried to poison him and accused her of killing his siblings. Police exhumed the children's bodies, claiming to find traces of acid in their throats, though the evidence was circumstantial and forensic science rudimentary by today's standards. The case against Martha was enough to spark public outrage. Martha was arrested alongside Thomas Morris in July 1909. The press vilified her as a scarlet woman and evil stepmother, a narrative that gripped Perth. Thomas was ultimately acquitted, but Martha was tried for the murder of Arthur. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding her guilty. Calls for mercy were drowned out by a public eager for retribution. On the morning of October 6, 1909, Martha Rendell was hanged at Fremantle Prison. She offered no confession, maintaining until the end that she was innocent, claiming she had only been treating the children for diphtheria. Was Martha Rendell a calculating killer who inflicted unimaginable suffering, or a woman condemned by flawed science and social prejudice? More than a century later, her story lingers an unsettling reminder of how fear, morality, and rumor can shape justice. 20. Anu Singh. Anu Singh was 25 years old, a law student at the Australian National University in Canberra, when she made a decision that stunned the nation. On October 26, 1997, she killed her boyfriend, Joe Singh, a young engineer described by friends as kind, intelligent, and devoted to her. The method was quiet and deliberate, first sedating him with Rohypnol, then injecting him with a lethal dose of heroin as he lay helpless in their shared apartment. Singh's life before the crime appeared promising. The daughter of 2 doctors, she grew up in suburban Sydney, excelling academically and entering the prestigious world of law and criminology. But beneath that image, she was battling inner turmoil. Friends later testified that Singh had grown fixated on her health and appearance, convinced she was suffering from mysterious illnesses, and often expressing feelings of worthlessness. Her relationship with Joe, though outwardly affectionate, was marred by her fears of abandonment and a sense that she was spiraling out of control. In the months leading up to the murder, Singh's behavior escalated. She confided to friends about suicidal thoughts and even hinted that Joe would die alongside her. These weren't empty threats. Days before the crime, she hosted 2 dinner parties, reportedly telling some guests that a terrible event was about to unfold. Whether they dismissed it as dark humor or failed to grasp her seriousness remains uncertain. The night of the murder, Joe Cinque fell asleep after the second dinner party, unaware of what awaited him. Singh gave him Rohypnol-laced coffee and, later, the heroin injection. As his body shut down, she waited through the night before calling for help. When paramedics arrived, Joe was already gone. The investigation moved quickly. Singh confessed at the scene that she had administered the drugs. Her demeanor described as erratic and at times detached, puzzled authorities. Within days, she was charged with murder, and her closest friend, Madhavi Rao, faced charges of conspiracy. Public reaction was immediate and intense. How could someone so educated, from such a privileged background, commit such a calculated act? At trial, Singh's defense argued diminished responsibility, citing mental illness and delusional thinking. In 1999, the judge agreed, finding her guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison with a 4-year non-parole period and released in 2001. Rao was acquitted of all charges. Joe's family, devastated, viewed the sentence as a grave injustice. For them, the legal explanation did little to soothe the loss of their son. Singh, meanwhile, continued her studies in criminology, later pursuing academic work focused on female offenders, a move that sparked renewed public outrage. Was this a tragic story of untreated mental illness, or a calculated act masked by legal defenses? More than 2 decades later, the question still haunts those who remember Joe Cinque's name. 21. Tracey Wigginton. Tracey Wigginton was 24 years old when she committed one of Australia's most notorious murders. Known later as the lesbian vampire killer, her crime shocked the country, not only for its brutality, but for the disturbing motive that was later revealed, a desire to drink human blood. Born in 1965, Wigginton's early life was marked by hardship. She lost both parents by the time she was 12 and spent much of her adolescence in foster care. Accounts suggest she struggled with identity, abandonment, and feelings of alienation. As an adult, she found community in Brisbane's Gothic subculture, where talk of vampires and blood rituals was more than mere fantasy. Friends would later recall her fascination with the occult and her claims that she survived not on food, but on the blood of animals and occasionally willing partners. By 1989, Wigginton was living with her girlfriend, Lisa Ptashinsky. Their relationship was intense, fueled by obsession and a mutual fixation on dark, ritualistic ideas. It was in this environment that Wigginton's fantasies escalated into something far more dangerous. According to police, she and 3 friends began speaking openly about killing someone so Wigginton could feed. On the night of October 20th, 1989, the group drove through Brisbane looking for a victim. They found Edward Baldock, a 47-year-old father of 5, walking home after a night out. Lured by the promise of company and intimacy, Baldock willingly entered their car. He was driven to a secluded riverside park, unaware of the plan unfolding around him. What followed was swift and merciless. Wigginton stabbed Baldock repeatedly, a frenzied attack that left him nearly decapitated. Reports from her later confession suggest she felt nothing as she carried out the act. No anger, no remorse, only a chilling detachment. Afterward, she washed the knife in the river and calmly left the scene. Baldock's body was discovered the next morning, and within 24 hours, police traced the crime back to Wigginton after finding her bank card at the scene. The investigation revealed details that horrified the public. Her admitted fascination with vampirism, claims of living on animal blood, and the group's premeditated plan. In court, Wigginton pleaded guilty to murder, sparing the victim's family a lengthy trial, but leaving unanswered questions about her true motives. She received a life sentence, while her accomplices received varied terms from life imprisonment to acquittal. During her decades in prison, Wigginton maintained a polarizing presence, alternately expressing remorse and denying the vampire label that made her infamous. When she was paroled in 2012 after 22 years behind bars, debate erupted. Had she truly changed, or was she simply skilled at hiding the darkness that once drove her? Even now, the case lingers in public memory. Was Tracey Wigginton a troubled woman lost in fantasy, or a manipulator who found power in horror? That question still unsettles those who remember the night Edward Baldock never made it home. 22. Elizabeth Woolcock. Elizabeth Woolcock was just 25 when she stood on the gallows in Adelaide jail, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. On December 30, 1873, she became the only woman ever executed in South Australia, hanged for the mercury poisoning of her husband, Thomas Woolcock. But more than a century later, questions linger. Was she truly a murderer, or a victim of her circumstances? Born Elizabeth Oliver in 1848 in the mining town of Burra Burra, her childhood was marked by tragedy. At 4, her mother abandoned the family. At 7, she endured a violent assault that left her unable to bear children and dependent on opiates to manage chronic pain. Orphaned by 9, Elizabeth was placed in service, where her access to drugs deepened her dependence. Despite these hardships, she was described as resilient and even taught Sunday school in her teens. Yet beneath the surface, trauma and addiction followed her into adulthood. By the mid-1860s, Elizabeth had moved to Moonta, South Australia, where she met Cornish immigrant Thomas Woolcock, a widower with a young son. Thomas initially hired her as a housekeeper. Gossip about their living arrangement pressured them into marriage. Elizabeth hoped for stability, but the reality was bleak. Thomas drank heavily and was reportedly abusive. Multiple attempts to leave failed. Each time, she was drawn back to him. Her isolation deepened, and so did her reliance on morphine. In 1873, Thomas fell gravely ill with severe vomiting and stomach pain. Over several weeks, 3 different doctors treated him, each offering conflicting diagnoses. One prescribed pills containing mercury, a common remedy at the time. Thomas's condition worsened, and rumors spread when Elizabeth was seen desperately trying to obtain morphine from local chemists. When Thomas died in September, suspicion quickly turned toward his wife. The inquest and trial were swift. Witnesses testified about Elizabeth's troubled marriage and her frantic efforts to secure drugs. Prosecutors painted her as a scheming wife who had poisoned her husband to escape his cruelty. Defenders argued the evidence was circumstantial. The symptoms Thomas exhibited matched several natural illnesses, and the mercury in his system could have come from prescribed medicine rather than deliberate poisoning. Nonetheless, after just 20 minutes of deliberation, the jury found her guilty. On the morning of her execution, Elizabeth handed her minister a letter, a confession of sorts. In it, she admitted to giving her husband what she ought not. Yet the tone was one of spiritual repentance rather than legal clarity. Modern historians argue the statement was more about seeking forgiveness than revealing fact. To this day, researchers debate her guilt. Was Elizabeth a murderer, or a woman condemned by flawed medicine and Victorian morality? Perhaps the real tragedy is that she may have gone to her death misunderstood, a victim not only of her husband's abuse, but of a justice system ill-equipped to see her pain. 23. Barbara Anna Wyrzykowski. Barbara Ann Wyrzykowski was only 25 years old when she made a decision that shocked Australia. On July 3rd, 1999, she drove her 5 young children, Mark, aged 8, twins Sarah and Luke, 5, Jesse, 4, and baby Jade, just 1 year old, into a remote state forest near Perth. By the end of that day, all 6 of them were dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. The case would leave the nation struggling to comprehend how a mother so devoted to her children could commit such an act. Barbara's life before that day was a portrait of quiet struggle. Born in 1974, she entered motherhood as a teenager. By 23, she was raising 5 children with her de facto partner. The family lived modestly and Barbara worked grueling night shifts at a fast food restaurant 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., while her partner worked days in construction. Their schedules left little time for rest, and even less for support. Friends described her as kind, loving, and fiercely protective of her children, but also as someone carrying a constant air of exhaustion beneath the surface. Barbara had endured personal tragedies. A close friend had recently taken their own life, and Barbara herself was reportedly battling untreated depression. The weight of sleepless nights, financial strain, and caring for 5 energetic children without reprieve wore heavily on her. Those closest to her later recalled she seemed increasingly withdrawn in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. On that July morning, after a heated argument with her partner, Barbara loaded her children into the family's van and drove to a secluded track in a dense patch of forest southeast of Perth. There, she carried out what investigators would later call a murder-suicide. She sealed the vehicle, ran a hose from the exhaust, and waited as carbon monoxide filled the cabin. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that the children understood what was happening. When the vehicle was discovered, all 6 had passed. The investigation revealed no history of violence toward her children. There were no drugs or alcohol involved. Instead, investigators and psychologists struggled to explain her actions. Many pointed to profound depression and what is sometimes described as altruistic filicide, a distorted belief that ending a child's life is sparing them from future suffering. In Barbara's case, this may have been shaped by her own hardships and a perception that she could no longer provide for them. The public reaction was divided. Some condemned her actions as unforgivable. Others, learning of her relentless struggles and lack of support, viewed her not as a monster, but as a tragic figure failed by the system around her. In the quiet of that forest, 5 children lost their futures, and a young mother ended hers. Was this the ultimate act of despair, or a warped expression of love? And more hauntingly, could it have been prevented if someone had noticed her suffering in time? 24. Katherine Birnie. Katherine Margaret Birnie was born in 1951 in Perth, Western Australia. Her life began with tragedy. Her mother died giving birth to her younger brother, who also passed away shortly afterward. Left in the care of her grandparents, Katherine's childhood was marked by instability and loss. When she was 10, her father regained custody, but their relationship remained strained. By the time she was 12, she met David Birnie, the man who would shape and ultimately destroy the rest of her life. At 14, Katherine entered a relationship with him, defying her father's desperate attempts to intervene. Those early choices would set her on a path toward one of Australia's most infamous crime sprees. Katherine's teenage years were turbulent. She spent time in youth detention, worked as a housekeeper, and eventually married Donald McLaughlin, with whom she had 7 children. But tragedy struck again when their firstborn son was killed in a car accident. Over time, her marriage deteriorated. In 1985, Katherine left her family, abandoning her children to return to David Birnie, a man whose desires and obsessions had grown far darker since their youth. When Katherine reunited with David, the two became inseparable. Their relationship, toxic and codependent, fueled a spiral of escalating behavior. Psychologists later suggested Katherine's devotion to David bordered on absolute submission. She sought his approval at all costs, even when it meant crossing moral boundaries most people could never imagine. In October 1986, Katherine and David began a series of abductions that would later be known as the Morehouse Murders. Over 5 weeks, they lured women and girls, strangers and acquaintances alike, to their home in Willagee. Once there, the victims endured unimaginable fear before their lives were cut short. 4 women lost their lives. A 5th narrowly escaped, leading to the couple's capture. That survivor's bravery ended the killing spree and exposed the horrifying reality hidden behind the Birnie's suburban facade. Katherine's role in these crimes shocked the nation. While David was often seen as the dominant figure, Katherine's participation was undeniable. In one chilling account, She described taking part in a killing to prove her love for David, a statement that revealed not only her loyalty to him, but also her own descent into moral collapse. Following their arrest, Katherine and David both pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder. They were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. Katherine remains in custody to this day, her parole repeatedly denied. Her name permanently associated with the darkest chapter of Perth's history. Katherine Birnie's story leaves behind haunting questions. How far can devotion drive someone from humanity? And can a life defined by tragedy ever excuse a descent into such darkness?